And everybody for coming along, and thanks to Stephen for coming down from Belfast to present to us on this topic of Brexit, Trump and development education. It's obviously a topic that is on the forefront of everybody's mind at the moment, given everything that's been happening in the world over the last few months and I suppose particularly since last summer. And when it comes to Brexit, given that we're the week after Brexit has actually taken place, or Article 50 has been triggered, it's very pertinent right now to our work. It's a topic that we're going to be looking at in IDEA over the course of this year through various different events, including things like our annual conference. And this series of conversation circles is something that we've been doing. We started doing last year and we'll be doing throughout the year, so there'll be 3 more conversation circles during this year, and we are very, very interested and open to ideas from you, the IDEA members, for any topics we can do around conversation circles, so please do let us know. We're signatories to the DOCUS Code of Conduct on Images and Messages, so if anybody would prefer not to be included in either recordings or photographs that are used from the event, please let us know and we can ensure that in any editing or use of images afterwards we'll make sure that that's not the case, so you can let us know after the event. So finally, really just to introduce Stephen. So most of you I think will know Stephen well. Stephen is the director of the Centre for Global Education in Belfast, and he's also the editor and pioneer of Policy and Practice, which is one of the leading journals on development education in Europe, and I'd say worldwide, and is a brilliant resource, as we all know, for thinking and ideas around development education. So Stephen, over to you.
Thank you very much, Frank. Thank you for those kind words. This presentation is based on an article that I wrote a couple of months ago for Open Democracy, called "In the Age of Brexit and Trump, We Need Development Education More Than Ever." And it was really just an attempt by me to try to formulate some thinking around Brexit and Trump, because I, like everybody else, was in a state of complete shock the day after both events. The last thing I did before the EU referendum was check the odds checker, check the bookies, because the bookies are never wrong, and the Remain vote was 1 to 5, so it was an odds-on certainty. So I went to bed pretty relaxed and happy that I was going to wake up to a Remain majority, and then woke up to the shock of a lifetime, really, and I'm still scratching my head to some extent, trying to figure out what happened and why both events happened. So really the purpose of the article was to look at the causes of Brexit and Trump and to see if there are any similarities in those factors between the election of Donald Trump as President of the United States and Britain's decision to leave the EU last June. So as always with these things, I start with the economics, because within both the United States and the UK, there have been stagnating wages going back over a period of a few decades. So recent research indicates that in the United States, over the last 30 years, the growth in incomes of the bottom 50% in that country has been just about 0, and the incomes of the top 1% have grown by 300%. So we're seeing a gross polarization of incomes between the very top income group in society and those in the bottom. And it's a similar story in the UK, because the Joseph Rowntree Foundation found in 2014-15 that about 21% of the total population were living in low-income households, and that's a proportion that has barely changed since 2002-2003. And it seems to be a global picture as well, because Oxfam, as I'm sure many of you know, Oxfam produced a report, a really good report a couple of months ago, called An Economy for the 99%, and in that report they found that 8 billionaires, 8 men, own or control the same wealth as the 3.6 billion people who make up the poorest half of humanity. So the economic picture seems to be one of economic stagnation, which I think has resulted in a level of alienation with mainstream politics and a disconnect between these people who are struggling and the mainstream political parties. Now, health warning here, obviously, I'm generalising to a large extent, but I think you have to when you're using statistics like this. But I think there is definitely something in that, and that the Leave campaign seemed to register with the people who are struggling in society, and similarly with Donald Trump and those who voted for him. So, you add to the stagnating incomes racism and Islamophobia, which seem to be prevalent in both campaigns. You know about Trump's campaigns made during the stump about building his famous wall with Mexico, keeping the migrants out, expelling undocumented immigrants, and banning Muslims from entering the United States. And I think what he managed to do was to connect migrants and inward migration with stagnating incomes. And I think that was a similar story in the United Kingdom as well. And of course, since the election, he has tried to introduce a temporary ban on 7 Muslim majority countries, which has since been overturned in the courts. He's attempted to ban Syrian refugees indefinitely, and in his last budget he proposed a cut of 28% to the US aid budget. So I think what you're seeing is a retrenchment by him of the United States from the rest of the world, and a cutting off with multilateral institutions like the UN in terms of the US aid budget. So it seems to be, as I say, a kind of withdrawal from the world that's happening under Donald. And it was a similar story, I think, during the referendum discussion, because I think this was the dominant issue from that debate. It was a poster that was unveiled by UKIP, by Nigel Farage, obviously the dominant voice within that campaign, and it was around this issue of border control and keeping migrants out. A very similar message to the one that was made by Trump. The EU has failed us all, and the strapline at the bottom says we must break free of the EU and take back control of our borders. Now, the EU has experienced nothing like the levels of immigration that other countries in the EU have. This photograph, this picture was actually taken in Slovenia in 2015, and the level of immigration, as I'll show you in a second, into the UK has been relatively light. But again, I think he managed to successfully connect this issue of stagnating incomes and a failing economy with inward migration. And I think that's one of the reasons why the UK voted narrowly to leave the EU. So some facts that contradict the narrative that came out of Brexit and came out of Trump. They very much contradict what they have said about inward migration. So for example, 9 in 10 of the world's refugees are in fact sheltered by developing countries. Britain ranks 16th out of the 28 member states in terms of asylum applications. Britain has only pledged to accept 20,000 Syrian refugees by 2020, which is just 4,000 a year from a total of 5 million Syrian refugees in total. In 2015-16, Britain received 41 applications for asylum, which is just 3% of the EU total. And the EU itself has hosted just 6% of the world's 65.3 million displaced people. You can see there the Africa and Middle East shelter the vast majority of displaced people at 68%. So I think those statistics really contradict a lot of the arguments that were made by Farage and the Leave campaign about inward migration into the UK. And the bottom point there shows that the US accepted 85,000 refugees in 2015-16, which is just 26 refugees per 100,000 of the population in the US. So inward migration into the US has also been comparatively light. Yet, to listen to these political leaders, you would think that there was a massive influx of refugees coming into the UK and the US. And I think the other arguments that were missing from, certainly from Brexit and from the presidential campaign, were the benefits of inward migration. So I got these points from an IMF document, the IMF hardly being a bastion of left-wing socialism. They came out with some of these points about inward migration having major benefits for the host communities. So for example, low and high skilled migrants increase income per person and living standards right across the board. High skilled migrants bring diverse talent and expertise to host countries. Low skilled workers fill essential occupations for which natives are in short supply. Migrants are essential in advanced economies where the working age population is shrinking, and migrants increase general wealth. They increase GDP per person by up to 2% over the longer term. Again, I think these arguments were missing during the debates around the EU referendum and around the presidency. The other thing that Brexit and Trump have in common is this spike in race crime that happened after the election of Donald Trump and after Britain left the EU. So in the month following Brexit, there was a 41% increase in the number of racially or religiously aggravated crimes recorded by 31 police forces in England and Wales. And in the US, there were nearly 900 hate incidents reported in the 10 days following the election of Trump. I think the reason for that is that racists actually felt emboldened by the election of Trump and the decision to leave the EU. They feel that these decisions almost validated their positions in regard to migrants, and I think that resulted in this spike in race crime. And I'm sure you've seen in the news over the last couple of days that a 17-year-old Kurdish Iranian was viciously attacked by a mob of 30 people in Croydon and has been left fighting for his life. So this sort of stuff isn't ancient history, it's still happening all the time. The other thing I think that Brexit and Trump had in common was this issue of sovereignty and taking back control of your borders, and the fact that you were losing decision-making power to multilateral institutions. The EU, in the case of Britain in particular, I mean, this poster from the Leave campaign says the 23rd of June is the date we capitulate, or the date we regain our freedom from an immoral and corrupt institution. The language is a bit florid and over the top, but you get a feeling for how they feel about the EU. And I have to say, someone on the political left of things, I think there were persuasive reasons for voting Leave, but I don't think those reasons were properly aired or debated in the media, certainly not where I was. I'm thinking about the EU's treatment of migrants in particular, and certainly the very sordid deal more recently to return migrants who arrive in Greece back to Turkey, and also the treatment of Greece during their economic crisis. I mean, the EU is far from being a perfect institution, we have to accept that. But I voted to remain because I felt on balance that it was better to work collaboratively with other nations, and also there were a lot of safeguards and political freedoms that were being safeguarded by EU institutions too, I feel, that are now under threat because of this decision to leave. So, but these issues around the flaws of the EU weren't really discussed. I mean, the flaws of the EU were really discussed in the context of the right-wing agenda, the right-wing political agenda around migration and political sovereignty. But both Brexit and Trump, it was about putting America first, putting the UK first. That was emphasised time and again in the election campaign by Trump, bringing jobs back to America. And as I said earlier, the idea of withdrawing from the world and basically almost like putting up barricades around the borders and just prioritising the US economy. So I thought all of these points were kind of encapsulated in this quotation from the Oxfam report I mentioned earlier, An Economy for the 99%. As I said, it's a very good document and worth getting your hands on if you haven't had a chance to look at it yet. But it says, from Brexit to the success of Donald Trump's presidential campaign, there's been a worrying rise in racism and a widespread disillusionment with mainstream politics. There are increasing signs that more and more people in rich countries are no longer willing to accept the status quo. And why would they, when experience suggests that what it delivers is wage stagnation, insecure jobs, and a widening gap between the haves and the have-nots? The challenge is to build a positive alternative, not one that increases divisions. I thought this quotation seemed to summarise the challenge ahead of us, and I don't think there are any easy answers to them. But anyway, so in summary, similarities between the campaign of the Leave, similarities between the Leave campaign and the Trump campaign were these messages, I think. Inward migration is threatening public services, placing an unreasonable toll on the Treasury, taking jobs away from local people. This point repeated over and over about restoring economic sovereignty, putting the UK and the US first, cutting aid and building relations on a bilateral basis and on the basis of national prioritisation. Trade agreements should be bilateral. I think Trump has already withdrawn from the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement with Canada and Mexico, which he blamed for sucking jobs out of the US economy. So basically, for Farage and Trump, multilateralism is a bad thing. They're anti-multilateral institutions like the UN and the EU. And they also believe in small government, in rolling back the role of government in society, cutting public services, free trade, deregulation. So, I didn't really spend an awful lot of time in the article I wrote for Open Democracy about what we do as development educators. I'm more than happy to toss this one over to you guys as well. But for me, I think what the campaign to Leave and the success of Trump in the presidential election showed is that we need more critical thinking, more analysis, demystification. A lot of these skills seem to be absent. I think people were seduced by the messages of Trump and Farage and aided and abetted by the Daily Mail and papers like that share very rancid images and messages around migrants and refugees. I think one of the things that we could do as a sector is to work more closely with related sectors under the auspices of the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly 4.7, which has this target of ensuring that all learners acquire knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development. The reason I would suggest that is I think we still, I mean, I've been working in this sector a long time, and we still very much, I think, talk to each other but not other sectors enough. We still work in silos to a large extent, and I think there's scope for greater collaboration with other related sectors like environment education or human rights education. Obviously the international development sector. I think the other thing that we need to do is to increase support for development education from within the international development sector itself, from the big NGOs, because in the late 90s many of these big NGOs stopped supporting DevEd, and some of them today don't deliver development education at all. I've been praising Oxfam to the hilt through this report, but Oxfam don't do development education in Ireland. Save the Children, which are only based in the north, they don't do any development education. I don't know about across the water, but many of these organisations, Oxfam in particular, they were a mainstay of development education when I first came into the sector. And they were actually employing some of their staff and basing them in One World Centres in England, Scotland and Wales, which obviously stopped in the late 90s. It basically coincided, their withdrawal from DevEd coincided with the increased support for DevEd from DFID in the UK, and they still haven't really come back to the sector in the strength that's required. The other thing I would argue is that we need more grassroots, bottom-up DevEd. I'm guilty of this as much as anybody. We focus far too much on the policy makers and because they've got the money, but we don't do enough I'm thinking about Helena here and the community work that she does in development education as part of IDEA and with LYCS. We don't do enough of that type of work. I think we concentrate too much on the policy makers and on policy by government, which is important, but I think the balance isn't right. And you could see that in many of the Leave campaigns, they really didn't seem to have any awareness of the reality behind the issues that were being debated in the EU referendum campaign. So I think we need more DevEd at that level. I think we need to speak truth to power. I don't think we should shy away from calling out governments where they get it wrong, particularly at a local level. I think we've been shy as a sector in doing that, and I think we need to be braver about speaking out about what the government is doing here in Ireland. I think that's important, and I think above all we need to seriously debate alternatives to neoliberalism, because neoliberalism is the factor that's, I think, driving inequality here and across the world. It's behind climate change, it's behind tyranny in the workplace, it's behind the inequalities in the social and economic inequalities locally and globally. And we need to seriously debate alternatives to that. I recognise that within education we're to some extent on the margins, but we still have a role to play in terms of trying to find alternatives to neoliberalism and challenging it wherever it exists. So they are my tentative thoughts, Frank, very tentative thoughts about how we start to get our heads around Brexit and Trump and start to deal with the issues that they represent. So maybe we could have a conversation about some of these issues and some of the ramifications of these developments. I had a couple of questions that maybe could help to inform this discussion. So I was thinking that we could talk about this issue of building intersectoral links. How do we do that? Because I don't think we do it enough. How do we re-engage the DevEd sector, the development sector in DE, the big development agencies, and getting them more involved in DevEd? And how do we challenge the myths about migration? I think there are some of the key things that have emerged for me out of Brexit and Trump.
Right.
Okay.
Thanks very much, Stephen.
Okay.
That was, far from tentative, really comprehensive and detailed, and I think really very thought-provoking for all of us.